To hear the full episode, become a patron at patreon.com/deathpanelpod.
Welcome to the Death Panel. Patrons, thank you so much for supporting the show. None of the work that we do would be possible without you. To become a supporter of the show and get access to the second weekly bonus episode, as well as the entire back catalog of bonus episodes, become a patron at patreon.com/deathpanelpod. And to help us out some more, share the show with your friends, post about your favorite episodes, hold listening or discussion groups, pick up copies of Health Communism, A Short History of Trans Misogyny, and Abolish Rent at your local bookstore, or request them at your local library, and follow us at deathpanel_. I'm Beatrice Bolton, and I'm here today with my co-host, Tracy Rosenthal.
Hey, B. Hey, Mark.
And we're joined today by returning guest, Marques Vestal. Marques Vestal is an urban historian studying the social history of residential property in Black Los Angeles during the rebellious 20th century. His work links property conflict, the everyday contracts, solicitations, complaints, lawsuits, and murders over property to broader transformations of real estate, urban development, and Black liberation, and centers around a few key political relations to land: property, housing insecurity, municipal incapacity, and racial capitalism. Mark is also an assistant professor of urban planning and critical Black urbanism at UCLA and is working on his first book, tentatively titled Eviction in the Promised Land, A History of Race and Property from Skid Row to Watts. Mark, welcome back to the Death Panel.
Yeah, thanks for having me back.
I'm so glad that you're back on the show with us today, Mark. Many listeners probably will remember the fantastic episode that we did with you at the end of 2024 as part of our series on Tracy's book, Abolish Rent. And the three of us are also going to be in conversation at the upcoming Socialism Conference early July in Chicago. But we wanted to talk to you now again on the show, in particular, because we're at a moment where the connections that your work draws between housing, criminalization, land markets, and resistance in Los Angeles are a really crucial lens to help think through our current moment. So today we're talking about property and belonging in Los Angeles, past and present. Between the anti-ICE actions this past week, the mutual aid efforts that we discussed earlier in the year in response to the LA fires, and the broader political landscape, we wanted to look at some of the important precursors to relationships of place, property, and belonging that are playing out right now. And we also wanted to step back and talk with you, Mark, about the longer history of surplus and property in Los Angeles, the struggles over place and exclusion that have shaped and also continue to haunt the city. And we're thinking about how these histories remain unfinished and how they are surfacing again and surface every day in the present moment. In Los Angeles this June, protests sparked by ICE raids have swelled into mass demonstrations from downtown to freeway overpasses, with tens of thousands of people in the streets of LA, even as police and federal troops fire tear gas, stun grenades, and rubber bullets in attempts to disperse the crowd and take back control of public space. And this summer also marks 60 years since the Watts Rebellion, an anniversary that demands that we remember not just what happened in 1965, but the decades of dispossession that made that event necessary. And Mark, in your research, you point to 1907 as this really crucial inflection point in LA's history, when tents and shacks were stripped of legal tenure, when outdoor life was rendered both illegal and illegible. And you've been developing this idea that we've been talking about of explosive vacancy, where land that once sustained people is violently emptied and kept empty. And that vacancy isn't accidental. It's a strategy that's produced and maintained and shapes a certain relation to property and surplus. And one of the things that we've been thinking through together is how regimes of private property operate not just through ownership, but through expulsion. And that it's not just in the workplace where the instrumentalization and exploitation of surplus happens, but it also occurs in eviction courts, in sidewalk sweeps, in zoning maps, and in the distinction between indoor and outdoor life. And so to open us up, as we briefly discussed last time, you're working on a book right now, and that book traces this very powerful arc that brings us all the way up to Watts. And I want to ask, when we think about the Watts Rebellion, both its political meaning and the material conditions that made it possible, how does the history of eviction, vacancy, and the policing of outdoor space reshape what we think we know about that moment? And to echo something that you said in our recent call when we were sort of planning this episode, what kind of city did eviction deliver by 1965? What kind of LA was made from the kind of politics of surplus and place that we're going to be talking about today?
Yeah, thank you for that question and the overview. I hope that I can do it service. I'm still trying to work out these ideas, but when I've read about Watts, 1965, 34 people die. The curfew zone was the size of Manhattan, and the rebellion is argued by some scholars and organizers to have kicked off maybe 5 or 6 years of urban rebellions and uprisings throughout the country, some 250 urban uprisings in small towns and large cities throughout the United States into the early 1970s. And one way that I've thought about that rebellion, really because of what sparks the initial kind of just explosion of looting and fighting against the police, is usually some form of police violence. And we see this throughout the country, but there's others as well. But really, the idea about the Watts Rebellion is that it was an insurgency against police violence and the property destruction that then happens both to vehicles, but especially to buildings. And even today, when we think about the anti-ICE raid protests, the public discussion is like to kind of veer away from the property destruction and the looting as something that we want to not focus on, or we want to focus on the peaceful protest. But what's so interesting about both Watts and today, and pretty much every insurrection, uprising, riot that we have a discussion is there's always usually some kind of tally of the dollar amount of the property destruction that happens. So it's like, what are we tallying up there in terms of the cost of the property destruction? Is it the building, the concrete, the glass, the rebar, or is it also the property itself, the political relationships between us and the property lines that we've set into the land? And what does that mean when we decide as a community to set the shit on fire? Is that something to ignore? So there's a history of property over the preceding 50 or 60 years before Watts that speaks to what people burned. What property did they burn? Not just the buildings, the brick, the concrete, the wood, but those political relationships to land. And I'm particularly interested in eviction. So one scholar that wrote a very influential book, The Fire This Time, reports that, and others as well, there was a UCLA study that they performed several surveys throughout Watts, and they're asking people, like, what are you pissed off about? And of course, people are saying they're pissed off about the police and police brutality, but the number one complaint, the number one concern is housing. Mm-hmm. And so usually the way that I've seen scholars discuss the issue of housing is it's both high rents, but then also like a vast campaign of slum clearance that's happening. So people are paying exploitative rents, but they're also losing some of the most affordable housing in Watts. So just for example, in the 5 years preceding the Watts rebellions between 1960 and 1965, the people of Watts lose a third of their most affordable housing to rent hikes. And these sorts of issues around property really aren't discussed in the McCone Commission, which was the official commission that studied the causes of the rebellion. But then I also think that urban historians haven't really picked up and asked the question, well, what's going on with property? And particularly what's going on with the history of slum clearance and what does it mean? By 1965, we're usually thinking about slums in this instance as being the kind of self-built additions to single family homes that people are building in alleys and things like that. But the history of slum clearance in Los Angeles, and we also think about slum clearance as being something that's imposed by the federal government, especially in terms of urban renewal. But that history tracks back much further than federal involvement. And I've traced it to this massive eviction that happens in 1907. And so the 1907 mass eviction, Los Angeles witnesses the forcible removal of some 2,000 tenants throughout what at the time would have been the east side of Los Angeles, so east of Alameda. And this mass eviction targeted a particular kind of housing at the time. And it was categorized into two different categories. So we have tents and shacks. These were housing that was self-built by tenants using salvaged wood and canvas. And they, before 1907, were legally able to pay ground rent. And so the estimate was from about $1.50 to $3 to pay rent to pitch a tent or to build a shack. And I've traced that this tenure, this legal tenure, existed in Los Angeles for at least 16 years. The earliest example that I could find from a tenant is 1890. And so for 16 years in Los Angeles, tents and shacks had legal tenure. They were tenants. And this is something that Tracy has taught me, the Los Angeles Tenants Union has taught me, is that unhoused people are tenants. And the history supports that. The only modification that I would make it as a historian is that they're tenants in exile of legal tenure. They're tenure refugees. And so so part of what I was interested in when I saw this mass eviction and the destruction of people's self-built housing in 1907 is one question that I had was, well, let me dig into the history of just one of these sites, because these house courts, they were in Chinatown. They were in a part of the city known for some of the earliest segregation of Mexican Angelenos, which was Sonora Town. And they were also south of Chinatown in a section of the city that doesn't really have necessarily a name. Sometimes people reference it as the River Bottom, but it was behind the main passenger railroad station, the Southern Pacific Railroad Station, which in front of it becomes today's contemporary Skid Row. So these tents and shacks were behind the train station, behind contemporary Skid Row on the east side of Alameda Street. And so I dug into the history of the property there, and I wanted to kind of figure out, like, why was this land available for people to pitch tents and shacks? Like, how come we didn't see the kind of idealized development that the Anglo city leaders would have preferred, factories, brick buildings, things like that? And I ended up finding out that 1890 marked just a couple of years after a massive real estate boom and bust that happens in Los Angeles between 1887 and 1888. So that what we end up seeing with house courts, this tenure where tents and shacks could pay rent in order to secure legal tenure and avoid things like vagrancy enforcement, which was deadly and violent in Los Angeles, that they could do this in the aftermath of a wave of surplus property coming onto the market in Los Angeles and no regulatory infrastructure to stop them from doing it. And it was also shoring up property taxes for the city. They had mass property tax delinquencies all over Los Angeles because of the bust of this real estate boom that happens in 1888. So within this history, we can think about tents and shacks, the legal tenure of tents and shacks, house courts, as being an innovation, the other side of Los Angeles's own real estate modernity, not some last desperate strategy that people use to survive, the way that we kind of think about tents and shacks as being what you do when you have no place to go. This is a historic and modern tenure of Los Angeles that showed up, for example, with Los Angeles's first electric streetlights. So this 1907 eviction, this exile of tenants who lived in tents and shacks in 1907, it sets up Tracy helped me with some of this language, like it sets up a new regime of property, a new property paradigm that we've so far completely unacknowledged. Before I got into this research, I thought about tents and shacks as being coterminous with the category of homelessness. If you're homeless, you live in a tent and a shack. I had no idea that there was a time in Los Angeles where tents and shacks had legal tenure in Los Angeles. So when we talk about the history of slum clearance, but then also when we talk about the history and the production of homelessness, this isn't just, especially the way this, I'm also learning a lot from Tracy's recent article on the Grants Pass Supreme Court decision. If when I went back to go read that decision, the Supreme Court said nothing about property. The Supreme Court said nothing about the history of eviction, creating the public health crisis that they're saying that cities are supposed to be addressing with anti-camping ordinances. So there's major consequences here, not just in terms of the city we get at Watts, which is a city of violent slum clearance, a city where people had been alienated from the means of producing their own shelter, but also this contemporary moment. So that's one instance, this mass eviction of 1907. This is one instance in the ways that eviction creates this new property paradigm that we still live in, but is so far unacknowledged.
To hear the full episode, become a patron at patreon.com/deathpanelpod. You'll get access to this and the rest of our catalog of patron-only episodes, and be the first to get a new patron episode every Monday when it drops. With love, the Death Panel.